going to go ahead and give a little intro. All right, everyone, we're so glad that those that are here could be here. And I hope that those who are still trying to get on are able to do so. We are again doing it on a Zoom platform, and we appreciate you joining us here. And sometimes things don't go as smoothly as we'd like, but we're grateful for those of you that are sticking it out with us and trying to figure this out. We're really excited to be talking about gardens. I noticed that we are getting back into like registration for our community gardens, which gets me really excited and gets me thinking that, oh, maybe winter will end at some point and we'll be able to grow things again. These classes are provided by the Idaho Falls Community Garden Association, and this is a local, entirely volunteer-run nonprofit organization. And we're devoted to teaching organic gardening practices and providing space in the community for people to grow things. We'd like to thank our wonderful board, Lauren Koss, Sue Holt, Sue Miller, Tony and Christy Applehans, Denise Olson, Elise Hart, and Michael Reichenberger, along with our exceptional on-the-ground, in-the-dirt garden coordinators. And they're the ones that run things at the actual community garden spots. There are 3 IFCGA gardens in various locations around Idaho Falls with plots available to members of our community. Registration for these plots opens April 2nd, and you can watch for further details on our Facebook page, our website, ifcga.org, or our constant contact email list. And if you want to get on that list, you can ask for that on our website. Also, we've had some questions about how to make donations to offset the cost of Zoom since we aren't meeting in person. If you have a Venmo account, you can make a donation to IFCGA by going to Venmo and searching for IF Community Gardens, or you can send your donation to the address at the bottom of the directory page on the website. So yeah, thanks for that if that's something you're interested in. All right, as we go into our classes, we're going to keep everyone muted with video off to avoid overwhelming our system. And you can submit questions to myself, Elise Hart, in the chat, and we will address those at the end of the presentation, or I guess whenever Ariel wants to open it up for that. These classes are designed to teach and promote sustainable organic gardening methods and practices, and we're thrilled to be joined today by Ariel Agenbrod. And Ariel serves Southwest Idaho as a University of Idaho Extension educator in community food systems, urban horticulture, and small farms. She's committed to helping individuals and communities grow. Her areas of specialization include home and market vegetable production, direct marketing of small farm products, organics, and gardening with youth. Awesome. We can talk about that, Ariel, because I ran kids garden programs for a while. For 8 years as a horticulture educator in Caldwell, she coordinated and taught the Canyon County Master Gardeners and organized and taught several small farms classes and workshops annually. She created the Idaho Victory Garden series, and I'm hoping that maybe you'll tell us a little bit more about some of these things. A popular U of I extension program designed to help families produce more food at home. She also started the Master Gardener School Garden Mentor Program, which trains and certifies volunteers to support school garden projects statewide. Since the summer of 2015, her focus has turned to community food systems in the greater Boise metropolitan area, particularly working around issues related to hunger relief, farmers markets, small-scale food processing, farm-to-school programs, and community gardening. So you have quite a few things that you have participated in and organized. So we're really thrilled to hear what you have to tell us today about edible landscaping and small space gardens. So I'll just turn the time over to you, and we'll soak up whatever it is that you have to tell us.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Elise. And, I have to say, I know that Zoom is not a good substitution for getting together in person and sharing and talking and all of that, but it is kind of cool because there's not really probably much likelihood that I would have been able to travel to Eastern Idaho at this time of year to give you this presentation. And so I just love getting to meet gardeners around the state, even if it's virtually, and be able to talk about the things that we love. And I love talking about growing food anywhere. So from a large scale farm to a little tiny pot. That's kind of what we're going to cover today. And hopefully I'll keep it within the time frame. No one likes to sit on Zoom for too long, but we're not going to get super in depth in some of these things, but I'm hopefully going to direct you to some resources if you really want to do some more research and get a better understanding of some of these topics. So wonderful. And then, like Elise said, throughout the whole talk, put your questions in chat, maybe your comments, if there's something you're doing that's really cool. Gardeners have so much to offer and share, and we learn a lot from each other. So yes, thank you for reading that bio. It's always funny to hear someone talk about you. I work for University of Idaho Extension. We are the community outreach arm of the College of Ag and Life Sciences for University of Idaho. We have county offices in 42 of the 44 counties. We are currently down an educator in, in certain parts, but we do have a pretty good team that serves Eastern Idaho with a kind of roving master gardener program and some other things. I did want to say some of you may have been involved over the years in our regional master gardener conferences. We have not had one since 2019, but when we do have them again, hopefully soon, they're at the BYU Idaho campus in Rexburg, and it's a full day of workshops, tours, hands-on activities. It's so much fun for a gardener, and hopefully that's something that you could join us for. So to keep up with some of those things and to find out what we're doing, I just wanted to give a plug for our Extension Gardens and Landscapes page. It's where you can find the nearest faculty members that are in your area, your master gardener programs, etc. So I'll send this out, and I'll put this link in the chat as well, so that you can check it out and visit it. All right. So enough of the shameless plugs for U of I. Go Vandals. Okay. What we're talking about today, though, is eating your yard, right? How do we get more food into creative spaces and grow more of what you eat and your family eats? So why are we here today? Well, we want to grow more of our own food. And, I'm always amazed how successful the community gardens are over in your area, because most people have access to a yard, I'm guessing. I mean, there are probably plenty of people that are living in apartments, but, Idaho is still fairly suburban / rural. And so being able to have your own garden space at home and then take advantage of a community plot is really cool. And it just shows how much interest there is in growing food in our state and in your region. A lot of times we do have limited space, though. I know my own yard is very tiny. It's, it's a postage stamp on a postage stamp, but I still want to grow food, right? And I have access to a community garden, which is great, but there's nothing like getting it out of your own backyard. So that might be why you're here today. Maybe you have already put as much garden as you think you can into your property, but where can you look for new space? We'll talk about that. I would imagine that many of us are done with winter. We want to be thinking about gardening now. I'm certainly thinking about spring and wishing for it. I probably have a little less time to wait living in Boise than you do, but it's coming, right? It's coming. And then maybe you're here, you're a lifelong gardener, you have a wealth of knowledge and information, but there's always something to learn. And I find even just looking at pictures and thinking about how others are doing it gets me inspired, and I make notes and get some of my best ideas when I'm just hearing even information that I've heard before. So why do we want to grow more of our own food? Why is this important to us? Well, if you look at modern life, right, this is where food comes from. For the most, I think for probably the majority of the population, including our children, right? It comes from the store. That's where food comes from. And where that food is coming from is increasingly distanced from our everyday lives as well. Food is coming from larger farms, more conglomerations. There's a specialized areas of the country, say in California and Arizona, where most of our fruits and vegetables really are coming from, if they're even being grown in this country. And more, we are living in tighter, more urbanized and suburban spaces that are replacing some of that farmland and some of that land used to grow a local food system. So this is where we might be living, right? And it just does not feel like agriculture. But there are still so many ways that we can utilize the space that we have to grow food. And I apologize, I'm having a little barking party behind me here in my house. It should cease soon. All right, and one of the reasons that I want to grow food at home is really for the future generations. I don't have kids of my own, but I have some wonderful nieces and nephews, and it's always been my joy and delight to share gardening with them and to introduce them to eating fresh foods that come out of the garden. And this little Cutie is 19 years old now, my goodness. But the only time she would eat vegetables is when she pulled them out of the garden. It was so wonderful. And then that's one of my children on the side there. All right, so how do we grow more food, right? What do we do? Well, today I'm going to talk about a few solutions that include edible landscaping, gardening in raised beds, intensive gardening, and growing in containers, because I was asked today to talk about edible landscaping and then growing in smaller spaces. So these last three are ways that we can utilize small space, inconvenient space, what have you, to get more production area. And then edible landscaping as its own topic for helping us to grow more food and also in small spaces. So that's the introduction. Let's go ahead and get started into edible landscaping. And I'd love to hear in the chat, some things that you've tried or some issues that you've had as we go along, and we can always come back to those questions. So edible landscaping, right? What is it? Why is it so cool? Well, in one way, it extends our capacity for growing food by utilizing areas that are traditionally used for ornamentals or landscape and putting food into them. It is also a way for us to create possibly a unique and still productive landscape. Maybe we're just really into the creative aspect of mixing and matching and bringing new things into traditional areas. And I think it also really gives us a new way of looking at both the ornamental and edible plants that we like to grow, including flowers, trees, shrubs, the annuals, perennials, and herbs. We might start looking at plants through an edible lens and realize they've got more to offer us than we were giving them credit for before. This is not a new concept at all, right? To have edibles incorporated into the landscape or to grow edible plants in beautiful and aesthetically pleasing ways. So if you go back in history, especially, to some of the large estates in France and England and all around the world, growing their own food for the community that lived on these estates was very important. And these gardens were done beautifully. They were part of the overall landscape design, even though they were focused on growing food plants. And so the classic French potager, right, was really tended in a very aesthetic and ornamental way using food plants. And it's still just a beautiful model and something that's still being done. And there, again, the integration of trees, shrubs, annuals, perennials, the same sort of levels of ornamental plants, just done with food producing species. And it's an idea that really continues to be popular and adopted by gardeners of all ages and in all parts of the world. This is one of the classic authors who really brought edible landscaping into the forefront of the gardening world. And this is Rosalind Creasy. Her original book is there on the left, the yellow one, Edible Landscaping. And probably about 8 to 10 years ago, she revised it and put out a brand new, absolutely gorgeous version here on the right with the purple label. And I was lucky enough to get to meet her when she came to Boise for a symposium and get a new copy of that book. And it is just so inspiring and so beautiful. And I've stolen some photos to put in here in this presentation, but hopefully I've credited them all. Oh, all right. Elise has that book. Isn't it wonderful? And then there's some spin-offs, like the edible Italian garden, the edible heirloom garden. So if your interests are even more specific, you're going to find something out there for you. So that's kind of the Bible of edible landscaping. There are some other great books that are a little bit more guerrilla gardening, right? Food Not Lawns and Edible Estates, The Attack on the Front Lawn. I'm not going to say that a lawn is bad. We have turf that we use for a lot of different reasons. But I always want to advocate against mindless turf, right? Is it growing there for some really specific reason, or is it just taking up space, or is it just justifying having a big lawnmower? I don't know. But there, if it's allowed in your neighborhood, why not reconsider at least some of the lawn? And Elisa's husband was just saying that he likes to dig up the grass and plant new gardens. So awesome. So let's go back and revisit our suburban house, right? This is our little cookie cutter in that suburban neighborhood. Some of you may be living in a home very similar to this. And when you're looking at it, you're like, I don't see any food production. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be significant food production, even in a very sort of blank slate like this one. Now, this isn't the same house, but this is just an example of what one could do with a property of that size and scale if you were allowed to completely rework the front garden, right, and turn it into a food producing area. And this is still very pretty, right? You've got a lot of different plants, you've got some hardscape and some, and some different heights, textures, etc. But all of these plants may be food producing, and that significantly increases the amount of food that you can grow on a space like this. So these are some beautiful pictures from that book, Edible Estates, right? So they went in and found properties and then over a period of weeks transformed them into edible landscapes. And what they found is not only were they creating food in these gardens, they were creating incredible community because, your neighbors are nosy. They want to know what you're doing. Why are you out there? And I think more and more we stop being in our front yards, right? We start being in our backyards and we don't talk to our neighbors. We don't wave at them as they pass by. We don't even know them sometimes. So when these gardens began to transform some of these properties, people wanted to stop. And they wanted to talk about what you were doing and how this was working. And then all of a sudden you started to create a tighter knit community. And that's what community gardening is all about, right? Sharing and connecting. So I just love this one. I'm going to do the before and after again because it's so cool. So there's the before, right? Turf, mindless turf. It's holding down the weeds, I guess. So they did this all too through no-till, like sheet mulching. And this was in a part of the country where that was a little bit more effective sometimes than where we are because we don't always get enough rain to really break that down. But they started with layers of cardboard and then added soil on top of that and then planted and then did a really heavy mulch. Because yes, weeds and things like that are definitely a problem with this kind of project. But I just think that's beautiful. All right, so you may not be ready yet to rip up your whole front yard, make that kind of commitment, or it may not be allowed. A few years ago, a friend and I went through some of the different covenants and CC&Rs that were on file with the city of Boise to see how restrictive they were. And I was amazed at how restrictive some of them were. They actually said you will have a flowering plum, and around that flowering plum, you will have a tree ring that may have petunias or pansies or like 3 other things. Like, wow, okay. So you may have some limitations there. Even if you're not ready or you're not allowed to do that, start small. Let's talk about some simple swaps, additions, see how it works, see if you like that, right? And then go on from there. Capitalize on where you have the best situation for edible plants. So in some cases, your front yard may not be the best place for edible plants. In some cases, it might be where you get the most sun. So let's try to take advantage of that. And then maybe, your backyard, you move to more recreation area. And then a really great way to test the waters is to consider containers or these other less permanent additions where you're not making that huge commitment. You can move things around. And that's great for those of you that are constantly fussing, with like, oh, that looks better over there. I'd rather have it there. And I've also heard gardeners in your area and like up in McCall and other short season areas, growing things in containers allow you to bring them inside a lot easier, especially when the weather is getting really bad. So let's talk about some different really simple steps with edible landscaping. So one thing to do would be to swap out for edible trees and shrubs, right? So even if your CC&R or your neighborhood requires that you have, 1 flowering tree and 1 shade tree, can you choose edible plants for that? Could you choose a nut tree for your shade tree? And could you choose a fruiting or berry bearing, a tree that bears fruits and berries instead? So I'll talk about some different options for that here in a minute, but the same can be for shrubs. And anybody want to guess what this absolutely gorgeous plant is here on this slide? It's one of my personal favorites. I'll give you a second. I'll give you a clue. It starts with Q. Anybody? Ah, yes, Elise, you are correct. It is a quince. They range from this kind of light, soft pink to a really vibrant, dark, kind of magenta color. And many of the species put on an edible fruit that you can use in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about that in a minute. But yes, a quince. Very, very beautiful ornamental shrub. Kind of has a shape and structure similar to a forsythia or a spirea, and it blooms in early spring. Absolutely gorgeous. So another strategy or step would be mixing your vegetables into your ornamental borders, right? So you're not going to change anything per se. You're just going to be putting some veggies in. So here's a really nice, this was a raised border around a house that I used to walk by on my way to the park. And they had this real nice xeric landscape with, some hardscape and some little low growing ornamentals in here. And then every few feet, there was a squash and some herbs. And I thought that was just so fabulous. I think they even had some kale in here, and they really looked pretty natural and good. This was toward the end of the season. So yeah, there's a little powdery mildew on that squash, but it was just a neat way to incorporate edibles into something that was already pretty much permanently growing. Okay. And then possibly you can integrate some food into the front yard, depending on what you're allowed to do and the resources that you have. This was down in the east end of Boise, which is kind of close to where I live, but it's a really old neighborhood and very heavily treed. And I know there's neighborhoods like this in Idaho Falls and Pocatello and those areas, because I've been through there, where your sunshine and your sun access is pretty limited. Those big trees, either the roots are, really restricting what you can grow, or the lack of sunshine limits you. And so in this garden, the best sunshine they got was in this one corner of the front yard. So that's where they put their food. So you're all going to get a publication at the end of this presentation that we put out on edible landscaping that has a number of tables that include some of these swaps. So if you currently have, or you're looking at maybe a red maple or something like this, here are some other trees to consider. So this is just a really quick list, though, of some of the different trees that are flowering or fruiting or produce nuts that could be used as a swap. And some of them are pretty popular. Some of them need more care and attention than others. Yes, if you're going to grow a large scale standard apple, good luck getting many edible apples off of that, right? Because of codling moth and other diseases. But things like mulberry, some of the nuts, choke cherry, typically few problems, but they provide us with more than just shade and leaves. Quite a few different plants in the shrub category. This is just a really small list. And again, there's going to be edible parts of these. Not all of them are going to be significant food producers, but there are aspects of them that can be eaten. And you might be seeing Oregon grape, right? That prickly Mahonia shrub. Yes, the berries are edible. And when you cook them down with sugar, they make a really delicious syrup. So again, it's not going to really supplement your diet that much, but it's something that can be eaten. And then, some of like the currants, they put on a lot of fruit, and elderberries, people are using those more and more for medicinals. There's my quince. And then if we're looking at perennials, I'm going to show you quite a few, but just your common daylily is edible. The petals are edible. And rhubarb is a very ornamental plant that's very hardy and has a lot of, I think, value as a landscape plant and an edible plant. And then all of those perennial herbs that we love to grow. Some of them are beautiful. So here's just an apple tree in full bloom. You can't dispute the ornamental quality of this, but then also providing us with great food. Yes. Apples are a lot of work. We know that. That's not really the focus of today's presentation. But I'll get to what a jostaberry is. It's actually a currant and gooseberry hybrid. So tangy, hardy, pretty cool little plant. All right, so apples. Let's see, what else do I got? Oh, did I have something? Yeah, the apples. So there's that Oregon grape I mentioned. We use that a lot in landscape, especially even in commercial landscapes, but those berries, when cooked and sweetened, can make an edible syrup. There's that mulberry. Mulberries fell out of fashion, I think, because they were so messy, because birds would eat them and then poop mulberry stain all over, and then the berries themselves would drop on sidewalks. But if you've never tasted a mulberry, they are a revelation. They're really like a really sweet blackberry that's 3 times the length, and they're just wonderful. Love to see those kind of come back a little bit. And you can prune it into a shrub or let it grow into a standard tree. When I said roses, the rose petals are edible, but also the rose hips can be a great source of vitamin C. They can be cooked and used in jams and jellies and teas and things like that. And then we talk about some of our favorite herbs, right? Then we've got all kinds of things that we can be talking about, from this lavender to the different flowering oreganos, both the prostrate kind that creep and crawl and the big uprights that bring in tons and tons of pollinators. And I would say that's another great positive about these perennials, and especially the herbs, is their attraction to pollinating insects. So lavender, here's a picture from Rosalind Creasy's edible landscaping book. We've got the tricolor sage, and then that kind of lighter colored sage behind it. You've got a really beautiful oregano in front here on the front right. I don't believe it's hardy, but it is absolutely gorgeous, and the name is escaping me right now. But then on the left, you've just got curly parsley, but look at how pretty that looks when put in a flower pot. And in the front, it looks like probably some kind of allium or onion, and then behind it, some climbing roses. So pretty. And again, just our common garden sage, attractive to bumblebees, wonderfully edible and very hardy. So we look at our annuals. There's a lot of options for swapping out, right? If you're typically putting in petunias or basket plants or, you know, marigolds and things like that, those are all great and they have their purpose. But we have some beautiful ornamental annual vegetables. In particular, things like the greens, the kales, the cabbages, things that would be very hardy in your area and do pretty well. Swiss chard comes in literal rainbow of colors. Okra, you might have a little bit of challenge growing unless you really start it inside and get it really big before it goes out. But this photo is of a red potted okra, very pretty. And then again, the fruits of our tomatoes, eggplants, the flowers of our onions, and then the peppers. Some of them can actually be very ornamental. And we've got a lot of options when it comes to size too. So this is just a lovely picture of some of the different heirloom tomato colors that we can have out there. And again, you might be saying, we can't grow these in Idaho Falls. And maybe you can, and maybe you can't, depending on if you have access to starting them indoors. But I think, you know, we even struggle in Boise to grow some of these really big beefsteak heirlooms and get them ripe in time. But just a visual of the colors that are available to us. Lettuces and greens, we've just got so many options in terms of texture, color, shape of leaf, and flavor. And again, here's some kales in different shades of red and green, mixed together or separately can be really nice. And then here's that rainbow Swiss chard I was talking about, coming in red, burgundy, green, yellow, orange, and pink. Can be very, very pretty. And then this is a personal favorite of mine. This is a golden potted snow pea. And the other good thing is that this one's really easy to pick because you see the peas. And then here's an example again from Rosalind Creasy's book, and this is kind of playing on square foot gardening, and this is integrating, you know, some non-edibles, so those hens and chicks back there, the echeveria, with these little lettuces, and just what a beautiful juxtaposition. And over on the side, it looks like tarragon, maybe some rosemary, cilantro, flat leaf parsley, maybe some French sorrel, which is another really beautiful and hardy ornamental leaf, and then maybe some oregano back there also. Again, I recommend that book. It's so wonderful. Let's talk about edible flowers a little bit too. So, you know, flowers are not going to be a significant contribution to your diet, but it's fun to eat them, right? And that they can add a little burst of flavor or a lovely spot of color in things that we're preparing. And many, many flowers are actually edible, and some actually taste good and are worth eating. But I do have to put my little disclaimer in here about using caution when eating flowers. So are you allergic to that plant? You don't always know until you try it. So I would proceed with caution, taking a little tiny taste to see if you have any reaction, especially if you know that you often do have reactions. And the same with children too. Have the flowers been sprayed with any kind of pesticide? If you're not growing it yourself, you wouldn't necessarily know this, so just be careful. And again, if you're growing edible flowers, I like to grow them myself from seed. Or if I'm purchasing them in a greenhouse, wait a few cycles of bloom before you eat them. And are you sure that you've identified the plant correctly? That's something very important. So here are some of my favorite edible flowers. Daylily, the common daylilies, they've got a little bit of a citrusy, bright flavor. I've seen people do things where they like stuff the blooms with sweetened cream cheese or something like that, but mostly you're going to be using your edible flowers as a garnish or as an accent to a salad or something else. Calendula is a wonderful, wonderful flower. If you grow it, you will probably always grow it because it's also a rampant self-sower. And it can pop up in places you want it and places you don't, but I usually don't mind it because it's so cheerful and it's so bright and comes in really beautiful colors. You might also see it sold as pot marigold, but this is calendula. And it also has significant medicinal properties. So if you are growing a medicinal garden or you like to make your own tinctures or salves or things like that, calendula should definitely be in your garden. Nasturtium is one of the classic edible flowers. It's fun to eat because it's peppery and sharp, and it's also just a beautiful plant with its lily pad leaves and then its blooms in every shade of red, orange, yellow, pink. Really nice little flower. And then our hardworking little pansies, violas, Johnny jump ups, these flowers are all edible as well. And they actually have a nice sweet flavor that I think is really delightful. And so you'll see, if you're into Pinterest, you'll see cupcakes with pansies and violas on them, or different ways that these have been sugared or preserved. A really fun one, and one that can grow through most of the season. So let's just talk about a few basic things to consider when you're starting your edible landscape. So if you are planning your garden from scratch, maybe you're moving into a new home or you're starting with a blank community garden plot, you can actually start to plan that landscape with your edibles in mind. And in that case, you're maybe choosing your primary shade trees and your flowering trees and your shrubs, and you have a lot of flexibility and freedom in what you're going to put in there. But most of us probably already have in some ways an established landscape. And so how do we do this without just totally, mowing everything down and starting over? Well, start by just replacing the annuals that you plant with edible annuals, right? Because they're going to die anyway. You've got an opportunity to replace them. And then if it does come time to replace a tree or a shrub, consider an edible selection. And like I said, that publication we're going to send out has a whole list of, if a spirea is growing there, then consider possibly a quince or a currant. And then you could always too dig out more lawn area and put in more edible gardens. So some considerations though, right? Because with any kind of gardening, it's not necessarily easy or certainly not low or no care. So edibles are going to require potentially more preparation each year. Our edibles are producing fruit that is going to be harvested and eaten. So typically they are using sometimes more water. They need better soil than some of our landscape ornamentals. So we might have to actually amend that soil, get in there and make things really nice for them. It might take more maintenance to keep them weeded and watered, especially if we are not going to be using any chemical controls. Now, I know this group is definitely all about the organics. And so this can be a challenge too, if maybe you don't manage all the property yourself, right? Maybe you live in a neighborhood and they take care of some part of it, or you live in a complex or something. Also, you may use chemical controls in certain parts of your landscape, but not in your vegetable garden. So this would limit the chemical controls you could apply anywhere, because you're going to have food growing anywhere. And I think this is probably the biggest drawback to edible landscaping, is right when those plants are looking their most beautiful and biggest and best and most photographable, that's when you want to eat them. So I think about those pictures with the lovely cabbages in a landscape, or that Swiss chard. That's the time that you harvest it, and then you've got a hole. So having substitutions and backup ready to go is something to think about for your edible landscape. Oops. Yeah. All right. So that was the quick down and dirty on edible landscaping. And these next sections are going to talk more about some other specifics that help you when you're short on space, but they can also be part of your edible landscape. So maybe I'll just pause for one quick second, and if there are any outstanding comments or questions that we want to get to before we jump into the next section, we can do that. But my goal is to get you done in as close to an hour as possible. So anything we want to share or ask at this point? Okay. If you think of something, put it in the chat. Perhaps you're just sitting back and relaxing and enjoying looking at pictures of gardens. That is totally fine. That's what I'm here for. So what we're going to talk about next, let's talk about some of the ways that we can overcome our lack of garden space. So we're going to talk about raised beds, intensive gardening practices, and one of my favorites, which is growing in containers. As someone that moved a lot in my childhood and in my early 20s, and then when I was going to school, I never had a place for a real permanent garden. And so now that we've been living in our home in Boise for a while, I have some things that actually spent most of their life, over 10, 15 years, growing in containers, including some peonies that now are so much happier to be living in the ground. But if you're like me and you're kind of a collector and you have plants that have emotional or family significance, you just haul them around with you. And containers are a great way to do that. All right, but let's start with raised bed gardens. Anybody out there growing in raised beds? I find that they have so much to offer, and really we are teaching that all the time now. So some of the advantages is we get better drainage. You know, we tend to have heavier soils in certain parts of Idaho. Having those gardens being up and raised makes them warmer. Potentially, it also can increase that drainage, which then would lead to higher yields and expanding your growing season. Often the maintenance and access is really improved by having these gardens up and off the ground. And then if you do have difficult soils or difficult sites, you know, there's just, for whatever reason, it's not practical to grow in ground, this can give you a new way to look at that. There are so many styles and materials possible with raised beds that I can't even begin to tell you all about them. Your imagination is really the limit. But a few things that I would tell you to watch out for, I would avoid any treated lumber, any wood with old paint, because you don't know if that paint was lead-based or not. And I would stay away from things like tires and any kind of metal container that you don't know what it used to contain, you know, so barrels or bins or things like that, if there was any chance that it had held any kind of toxic material. And tires, you know, they can warm the soil. I see a lot of people use them. The research is inconclusive as to whether they leach materials and chemicals that can be taken up by plants and make you ill, but they do potentially leach those chemicals into the soil. And so just for that contamination, we recommend that you kind of stay away from them. But I know some people are also really limited in what they can afford and what they have access to. But these are the things that I would try to avoid. And then just another pro tip, I guess, is try to keep your raised beds under 4 feet wide so that you can reach across them pretty comfortably without stepping into the bed. And for some, like smaller folks, maybe even 32 inches is a really nice width, because the whole point is is having a bed that we can maintain without tillage and that stays nice and soft. So we don't want to be walking in there. Lots of different ways that these can be done. Sometimes just mounding the soil into a raised bed can work really well. Or we can actually build structures. So using things like wood, logs. I've seen using railroad ties, and those can be okay if they have they're no longer oozing anything or smelling. But again, that's, sometimes if you have a sensitive nose, they always smell. But just really plain untreated fir lumber is a great solution for raised beds. The garden center will try to convince you that you need this expensive cedar, but that is really not necessary. So this is a community garden in Nampa, Idaho. It's one of my favorite community gardens. They just have these really low raised beds because the soil is not bad. They just needed a way to contain it, and also to really differentiate what was garden and what was not. And so this is just inexpensive fir. They've only had to replace a few boards in 10 years. So it really holds up well. Our climate is pretty arid. You think about a lot of our gardening resources, they're written for the whole country. And so when they say cedar, well, yeah, and I think one of our folks today is from Portland. In an really rainy area, you want wood that's going to hold up. But we're just so dry here that you'll get good use out of even these cheaper lumbers. And you can just see how much food is being produced in these boxes. That cabbage patch is just incredible. And then here it is more on a smaller home scale, again, using the same kind of design. You can grow just about everything in your raised bed garden. And it's nice to have walkways between there that you can manage and mulch for weed control. Yeah, so lots of different options when it comes to raised bed gardening. So when we are going to be, though, I want to go back to that picture of the cabbage, right? So that thing is packed full, right? What are some of the secrets to getting that kind of yield? Well, you're looking at maximizing what you have, right? So we look at closer spacing. This doesn't mean that we ignore the spacing requirements. It just means that, say, on a seed packet, when it says to space something 12 inches apart in rows, 20 inches apart, right? You're not planting in rows. So those cabbages say that their spacing was 12 to 14 inches, right? Each of those cabbages, looks more like 8 to 10, maybe even. So each of those cabbages is spaced appropriately from each other. And then you've got this really nice wide row that fills in quickly, and each plant still has room to grow. And then what we're doing too is we want to grow vertical whenever possible. So we're getting things up and off the ground. We're creating more ground space because we're putting things into the air. So here's that same garden. And you can see, you might have been wondering what those PVC pipes were for that you saw in the previous picture. Well, each of these beds is equipped with PVC pipes that can be turned either into trellising, depending on the rotation, or they can be turned into mini greenhouses with row cover or plastic or frost blankets stretched across them. So here's an example where they're growing all their melons on this trellis, and that really frees up the ground space because obviously these beds are not super wide, and these melons could be, 5-6 feet sprawling across the ground. So some keys to intensive success. We do want to space more closely, but we don't want to space too closely, because then the plants start to compete with each other. They're not getting enough sunshine, and then you end up with really small and spindly plants. It's good to do a little bit of research about the cultivars that you're growing and see if these are suitable for more intensive growing. So you'd be looking for maybe cultivars that are a little bit smaller, maybe not going all the way to dwarf, but just thinking about the overall size of those plants and are they going to work in a close spacing, smaller area. We are asking more of the plant, and so we do need to maintain potentially a higher level of fertility. So this is going to mean more soil amendments, more compost, maybe more nitrogen, in whatever way that you're applying that. If you're using organics, they might need a little bit more blood meal, things like that to get that high fertility. And you typically will be watering more frequently when you're growing intensively too. And mulch can be one of our best friends. It can keep the weeds down until those plants have time to grow and create a canopy. It can also help keep our moisture in there. And then if you're using organic mulches, those are going to break down and add to our soil fertility. And then always important to rotate our crop families as much as possible so that we're not growing the same thing in the same spot year after year. And then we do recommend you try some succession planting and maybe even interplanting, which can have its drawbacks and challenges, but if you can get it right, can really double up what you're growing. So when we talk about succession planting, right, we're talking about no empty bare spaces. We're talking about that as soon as something is ready to harvest, it's harvested, it's pulled up, and you've got something new. Or it might mean that you're successively harvesting over a longer period of time. So there's a few ways to do that. So one way to do it is to plant, maybe you're growing one variety of green bean. It's your favorite green bean. There's no other green bean that you like. Okay, but green beans tend to have one main harvest window. So maybe every few weeks, you're planting a few more of those plants so that your harvest window is going to now expand. The other way that you can do that I like is to choose different cultivars that have different dates of maturity. And with green beans, it's really pretty interesting. You've got everything from a 45-day bean, like an early serve, up to some of the old classic heirlooms that are going to be more like a 65-day bean. So you could plant those all at the same time, and all of a sudden now you're going to have several weeks to maybe a month or more of harvest window as each of those varieties mature. So I like this because especially if you are a smaller family and you're not really into food preserving, it can help you avoid having too much of one crop ready at any time. And, you know, I like to eat salad all the time, right? Or I like to have vegetables not just once a summer. So succession planting gets you that consistent supply. Now, interplanting is a little bit different. This is when you are combining two crops in a shared space. I have done this really poorly over the years, and I've seen it done really well. So I kind of stopped growing it because I didn't have the patience to really work it out. But in theory, right, this is when you would grow a quick growing crop, maybe under a slower growing crop that's not going to take up all that room yet. Or when you take advantage of maybe growing into, you know, if you've got a trellis, now maybe you've freed up some space under that. And some people are really good at this, but I've just always found that neither plant got as big as I wanted, but I think I'm just not doing it right. Now, this Trinity Community Garden, they did it right. And one example is they had cucumbers on this trellis. It was really great. And then on the other side, I think it was I'm trying to think of where we are. I think that was the western side. They planted carrots. And so then the carrots were getting the benefit of our long afternoon sun. And then the cucumbers were growing on the trellis. So there was that space. And they seem to be pretty compatible that way. And if you're really into companion gardening and you've found some combinations that work for you, interplanting can be a great way to maximize your space. And I see so much interplanting in community gardens in particular because everyone's trying to use all the space that they have, right? All right, so last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of space saving, I said was one of my favorites, right? And this is container vegetable gardening. I really like to grow vegetables in containers. I think that it's not done as often, and I think that's because a lot of times we don't always have success right away. But I'm going to talk about some ways to have success. So first of all, almost any kind of container can be used for a container vegetable garden, from a 5-gallon bucket to a kiddie pool to a horse trough, but we do need to have drainage holes, and just putting some rocks or stones in there is not a good substitute for having the water be able to completely rush out of that container. Oh, great. Okay. Elise just shared a great resource for succession planting. Wonderful. I'll check that out too. The minimum capacity, I would say, for just about anything is 1 gallon. I think where we fall short in our container vegetable garden activities is we either choose cultivars that are not suited to containers, or we cram them into a really small pot. And when we think about the rooting depth and scope of some of our edible plants, that makes a lot of sense. When we took a look at what we're growing them in, right, we don't want to just put our garden soil into our container and grow. We want to really custom mix a really nice potting mix. I always like to add up to 50% good compost in the containers that I'm going to grow vegetables or herbs. And we want it to be well draining, but not so draining that it dries out really fast, because that isn't one downside of container vegetable gardens is you end up watering them a lot every day. So here's just some different examples, and then I'll get to a few more things. I love this one. This is from Rosalind Creasy's book. Again, this is just a little wooden crate. Those are all going to outgrow that in like a matter of days, but it was really adorable. It looks like we've got some beets or chard, some spinach, some little lettuces, and some pea plants. So cute. But here's maybe some more practical examples. So again, growing tomatoes in at least a 5-gallon pot, right? At least for one tomato. And then too, if you're thinking about like a really large or heirloom tomato that just is an indeterminate, so it just grows and grows and grows, I would give it the biggest pot that it can find. These little salad bowls are adorable. They can be great as gifts, but eventually those plants are going to outgrow that a little bit. And then get creative. Have you grown roots in pots? Right? There's no reason that you can't if the depth is right and if they receive enough moisture. Here they are growing carrots in a pot. And then this is just a bunch of different herbs and things growing in containers. And then this is kind of a hybrid raised bed container vegetable garden using cinder blocks. And you can plant into the cinder blocks, and then you can plant in that main middle section. So over the years, I have really honed the container vegetable garden in order to be more successful. And here's some of the things that I've really found. Number one is giving them enough space, right? If you have a container you think is sufficient for rooting depth, double that, and then you're probably in good shape. They really need room to grow up, out, and down. Another reason for a larger container is that when a vegetable plant is growing in a container, its roots are going to fill most of that container. And you think about one of the really beneficial properties of soil is its insulation, both against heat and cold. And so when these plant roots are growing to the very edges of that container, they don't really have the buffering protection of the in-ground soil. So we want them to have enough room to really develop. And this is again where I would observe the recommended spacing. So not cramming too much into that container. If we do have hot summers, lighter colored containers are going to stay cooler. If you do start to see like a lot of really pale container vegetable plants, it's often that their roots are just baking. And I do find that they do have to be fed more often, and there are organic options for this. I put a lot of compost into my mix, but I still find that they need supplemental feeding. So I'll use either a slow release organic fertilizer or something, like a fish emulsion or something else that I can mix with water and apply when I'm watering. They really do eat up the nutrients. And then this is my other really key takeaway is using adapted cultivars. And we have so many options to us available now for cultivars that are really suited for container culture. If you go through, a popular seed catalog, you'll probably find 2 or 3 of every different kind of vegetable that have in their name something like dwarf, bush, patio, container, tiny. Those are some of your keywords, especially when we're looking at things like cucumbers, tomatoes, squash, peppers. These are all going to grow really well in containers because the plant is meant to be smaller and stay smaller. And they can also be really ornamental too. And then water, right? If you can install a drip system and a timer to automatically water your containers, or like me, every evening is just spent out with the hose for a little while. Now, these are some examples actually from Idaho Falls. I did a school garden tour of more than a few years ago. You can see this was really a clever idea, right? Using an old shoe container for growing things, but you can see that there really wasn't enough space for these herbs to grow very well, and they dried out. But it was really cute. And I could see how this might be a really great idea for succulents or something that you weren't going to water. But for these herbs that needed a lot of water, it wasn't super successful, but it was a clever idea. This was another one that was working pretty well, was this horse trough planted with vegetables, and it kind of got a little blurry there, but you can see they've got parsley, tomatoes, peppers, and some other herbs in there. these can be really attractive containers, and they make them now. I've seen some that are only about 1.5 feet tall and they have no bottom. So it's just a really cool looking galvanized ring that you would set down and plant into. Be a little bit easier to move and a little bit lighter. These are pretty big and heavy, and I think they heat up too. And then one of my other favorites, and something that I used at my rental home for years, was these fabric grow bags. They come in anything from 1 gallon up to, I think, like, I don't know, 48, 6 feet across. And they're made of a fabric that feels a lot like felt, and it's very drainable. And you just fill it with a soil mix and you grow in it. And I've had really good luck with a lot of things in these. Really deep rooting plants like corn or tomatoes don't seem to do as well, but especially for greens and spring vegetables, I've really enjoyed these. And if you're living somewhere temporary, you can still have a garden, and you can just take it with you or empty it out before you move. And I really like these. Oh gosh, that was fast and a lot of information, but here we are at 11. So I would like to now open it up to questions or comments. And sorry. What am I doing here? Sorry. Yeah, I would like to open it up to questions and comments, and I will answer. And then maybe I'll just stop sharing so that I can see all of your faces. So anything that I would not recommend growing in a container. So I had limited success with raspberry plants in a container, only because I don't think the container was quite big enough. And raspberries thrive when they're able to grow through their runner system, and they really couldn't do that in a container. So those were not super successful. I also have never had really good success with big indeterminate heirloom tomatoes, like a Brandywine or something in a container. Again, just I think that the plant is just a little stressed when it's in a container, and those need everything that you can give them to grow and develop properly. I like terracotta pots just fine if they're large enough. The largest ones tend to break down faster, I've found, but I have some rhubarb that was growing in big terracotta pots until those pots fell apart, and then I moved them into plastic. But I felt like the terracotta was a little bit more insulating than plastic. And if any of you have answers or comments to these questions, please share too. I do really love peppers in a container. I feel like they grow super well, especially those little ornamental peppers and chilies. Yeah, I don't see any reason that you can't grow things like olives, lemons, figs, and things in containers as long as you can get them in and out. I think our challenge there is having enough light for them in the winter indoors. But if you've got a way that you can actually light them, have fluorescence or grow lamps on them during the winter, I think that would be great. Or if you really have a true sunroom. But most homes, the windows are not going to be probably sufficient to keep them really healthy. And then also you'll want to just really make sure and inspect those when they go out and when they come in, because a lot of times they're going to be attracting aphids, whitefly, sometimes fungus gnats, things like that. So maybe giving them a nice treatment of an organic insecticidal soap or neem, if it's safe for that plant, before moving it outside. And then again, before you move it inside. And maybe even just conditioning them a little bit to being indoors and outdoors, especially moving from in the house to outside. The sunlight is going to be a shock. So move them out to a shady spot and then gradually out into the sun. Just like you would for your little tender seedlings, right? Anything else? Anything you want to share from your own experiences? And you can turn your cameras back on if you want, but you don't have to. Toxicity issues with growing in plastic pots and buckets. Good question, Laura. Theoretically, no. The plastics that if we're purchasing a plastic that is intended for that purpose, then it is most likely considered to be food safe. Now, That is not a total guarantee, but there is really no research on those being unsafe to grow in. But if you're using plastics that were not meant for growing, then I would be a little bit careful. And it would be more that they're just going to break down and maybe off gas. But as far as like the plants being able to take up anything, that's probably less likely. Yeah, raised beds. Oh, great question. Straw bale gardening, Milena. I actually had a picture of a straw bale garden and I took it out because I was like, I don't want to talk about that. But I will talk about it. So we did a few experiments with straw bale gardening and did not have very good luck. And we thought about it a few different ways. The straw was heating up so much that I think the heat was too much for the plants. We also had a really hard time with nutrient deficiencies in those plants, even if we sprinkled soil and compost where we were planting. Where I have seen a really good use of straw bale gardening is in using the bales themselves to create a raised bed, planting and filling that with soil and compost, and then using that straw, pulling it over and mulching it, and gradually it incorporates. Another issue we had with the straw was that it was hard to find seed-free wheat straw in our area. And so the wheat would germinate and then it would just outcompete whatever we were growing in it. But using straw bales as a structure to construct a raised bed or even a compost pile is a great use if you have a resource, if you have a source for straw. Vertical growing or espalier. Oh, absolutely, right? So vertical growing, I talked about, trellising, but, even something like that little picture I showed you of the shoe tree, holding plants, something like that on a larger scale, right? So larger containers on some kind of vertical mount. I've seen that work really well for strawberries. I've seen it work really well for other kinds of herbs and more smaller scale plants. And then espalier, right? Training a fruit tree to grow along a wall or along a fence can be absolutely a beautiful and effective way to get more production. Yeah, love those ideas. And Elise, yeah, I appreciate raised bed gardening for the same reasons. And the older I get and the less I want to spend time on my knees, having a raised bed that I can just bend over or even sit on the edge is really nice. Anybody have any favorite designs or cultivars or anything that they want to share? Something creative that you've done that worked really well? And while you're thinking about that, I will share, I really incorporate a lot of perennial herbs into my landscape. And part of that was, always living in rentals and always being so so poor, being a student and a grad student and then, a new faculty member. I looked for things that grew really fast and were really cheap. And so things like lemon balm and calendula became my friends. Probably the next renters don't appreciate that as much, especially the lemon balm, but I've always incorporated oregano, lemon balm, and especially the sages into my landscape plants. And the sages are great because they're not invasive. They don't take over. And in my area in Boise, they stay looking good almost all year, which is really nice. And so I really like those. I like using chives too as landscape plants. Oh, the tumbling Tom, isn't that an adorable one? I love it. There are some super dwarf tomatoes that don't get more than 12 inches across and tall, and they're so fun. Yeah. And I didn't talk about hanging baskets, partly because they need so much water, and then you're watering, the water's falling everywhere, but you can grow some of these in hanging baskets too. Ooh, I love that idea. Yes. Okay, so Elise is talking about using vining plants and growing them over the cattle panels, or in some parts of the country, they're called hog panels. Any kind of large metal that you can shape or mount. Oh, it's so cool. I love that idea. You could do beans that way, cucumbers, melons. And especially if you're gardening with kids too, I mean, going through a bean tunnel is just magic. And you can do I didn't mention grapes at all, partly because I know that you might be limited in some of the grape varieties that you can grow. But if you can grow some grapes, they can be used in a lot of different aesthetic and productive ways. People are probably going to want to see pictures of that, Elise. Oh, are there very many perennial vegetable varieties? Good question. Well, there are things like asparagus, right, which are going to be perennial and are actually quite ornamental once they've started to unfurl and turn into ferns and then set their little berries. So I would say asparagus. Artichokes are technically botanically a perennial, but good luck getting them to overwinter. We have very little luck with that in Idaho. Rhubarb, while not a vegetable, it's vegetative, but we treat it like a fruit. That would be perennial. I'm trying to think what else. It's funny is like tomatoes and peppers are perennials when they're grown where they're native. So you could potentially bring them in and out, but they get pretty straggly. Anybody else thinking of a perennial vegetable? Yeah. But most of the vegetables we treat as annuals here. Well, you guys, I really appreciate you joining on a Saturday morning. We probably have lots to do, but hopefully I've given you some ideas, and I would just happy spring. It's coming, right? It's still a little ways out, but I'm excited thinking about gardening and thinking about getting back outside. So thank you for letting me share with you today.
Ariel, it's been a delight. I've gotten a lot of actual personal messages from people saying that they really enjoyed your presentation and thought it was just wonderful. So thank you.
Good. Well,
also,
if anybody thinks of anything later, they're welcome to reach out, and then you're going to send out a copy of the slides and then that edible landscaping publication and another on container gardening that is not just about edibles that I picked out.
Yeah. So before you leave, everyone, if you could actually leave your personal email in the chat, I will take those down and make sure that we get those handouts and the slide presentation sent to you. And then I don't know what else involved, but I will talk to the guys that run our website and see if we can maybe upload them, if that's something you're okay with, Ariel.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Onto our website so you can access them there. But yeah, I'll just take down everybody's emails and make sure we get those sent out. But thank you so much, Ariel. It's been delightful.
Ah, thank you. Oh yes, and Laura mentioned that onions are perennials, especially like the Egyptian walking onions and things like that. Good point. Got smarties here. Well, it was really fun to talk to you all. I love talking to gardeners. It's one of my favorite things. So have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Thanks.